First of all, let me thank y'all for thank you for allowing me to come and speak tonight. I am not a quilt maker. I know very little about quilts. Just to be very honest with you. But sometimes in life, things just land in your lap, and this quilt pretty much just landed in our lap, and so that's the story that I'd like to tell you about tonight. Author Joshua Cohen said that a people's legacy, a people's legitimacy, is derived from its artifacts. We know that the Egyptians, we know a lot about the Egyptians from their pyramids, from the artifacts that we have gotten from their tombs. So as people's artifacts are left for history to view, that legitimizes that civilization. This is an artifact from it's much sooner than, or not that far away, so far as time is concerned. But this is an artifact that, to me and my wife, legitimizes our past, our ancestors, because it has names of our families on the quilt. Betsy and I were visiting with a cousin of hers, Vicki King. I'm gonna be mentioning a lot of names tonight, Brunswick County names that some of you may know, some of you may not know. But we were visiting with her, having dinner. She lives in Ocean Isle Beach, and after we enjoyed the dinner, she mentioned that she had a quilt that her grandmother, Miss Veda Lee King, had passed down to her. And so she showed it to Betsy, and it had two of Betsy's aunts' names on this quilt, along with one of Betsy's grandmothers. And we were looking at it and looking at the different names, and I saw a lady's name there, Miss Georgia May Clemens. I said, wow, that was my great aunt. And then I kept looking, and I saw a lady's name by the name of Letha Sellers. I said, well, I had a grandmother that was Letha Sellers. So it was just one of those moments. Betsy and I kind of looked at each other, that our families were linked by the names that were on this quilt. And it's not so much that the names that are on this quilt, it's the fact that these women spent time and energy making these squares and putting them together. That just legitimizes the link that our family has. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with quilt making. It's a tedious process from what I can understand. This area, in the supply area, when I was growing up, every corner you almost turned around, there was somebody selling quilts. Quilt making was a very big thing years ago. And it probably is still in some areas, but not so much around here as it was at one time. In fact, right on the corner of 17 and Mount Vista Road was Johnny and Liza Nance's house, and she would put quilts out in her front yard to sell. She had a quilt making business. Miss Vernie Carpenter, who lived across the road over here, she had a quilt making business. There was a lady whose last name was McCraney, who lived right down from here. I don't remember her first name, but she was in the quilt making business. I happened to be talking to today Miss Mary Catherine Royals. She said, well, Perry, I used to make quilts all the time. She said, everybody around here used to make quilts. She said, but that generation has died off, and all that's left are what people have saved. Now, there are some areas of the country where quilt making is still quite popular. especially up in the, I think in the New England area, it's quite popular. You can go online and look and see. But friendship quilts, such as this, they became popular around 1840, 1850. They were put together by ladies, women in a family, and they would get the women in the family to put together a square, either sew their name on the square or write their name on the square. And then they would get them all together and make a quilt. That kind of died off around 1865, 1870. And then after the Civil War, when the West opened up, and people started moving from the East to the West, as a memorial for that event of the family leaving, there was a resurgence of the making of friendship quilts. So there's a lot of friendship quilts around. In fact, there is one here in Supply at Mount Olive Church. They had one made. I forget the year, what it was, but they had it made to help raise money for their church, and they auctioned it off. And I forget the lady's name who bought it, but a few years ago, Anthony Clemens, who's the pastor of Mount Olive Baptist Church, got up with a lady and asked her if she still had it, and she said yes. She said she'd like to donate it back to the church as part of the church's history. And then there is this quilt. Now, I can remember as a child going down to Oxpen. I was talking to somebody earlier about Oxpen, and they're at Silent Grove Cemetery. And we would go, she would go and I would go with her, and she would go to Miss Nadine Clemens's house and help her make quilts. And I can remember that as a little boy, that was the best place to play underneath the quilts while Mom was sewing than anything I could do. That was just fond memories of playing underneath that tent, you know. It was wonderful. It took time to make a friendship quilt. As you can see, in this particular quilt, there's 24 squares. I think in the one at Mount Olive, there's 40 squares. But there's 24 different squares that different ladies in the community made. And I don't know whether these ladies got together and put the quilt together, or sometimes they would do that and they would call those quilting bees. Miss Catherine Royals today told me that the ladies in the community would get their squares made, and they would go to one particular lady's house one week. That lady would fix supper for everybody. And after supper, then they would work on the quilt. The next week, they'd go to another lady's house in the community who was in the group. She would fix supper, and they'd do the same thing in her house. And that's how they would make quilts. So I don't know if that's how this particular quilt was made, or if it was put together, if the squares were sent out to the ladies and then they sent them back to Miss Veda Lee King, who then put the quilt together herself. I don't know. But what I do know is that there are 24 different squares here with names of ladies in the Ash, Exum, Waccamaw, Supply, and Bolivia areas. And I'm going to read to you, there are two, on most of the squares, there are two dates. One date is the ladies, we believe, their birthday. For example, this lady, L.A. Ross, it says she was born, B-O-R-N-E-D, August 8, 1856. And then there is another date on here under her name. It says March 10, 1938. All of those squares that have two dates, the second date is either 1938 or 1940. So that's when I'm thinking that the quilt was put together, 1938, 1940. But all the other dates are their birthdays. I'm going to read off the names of the ladies that are on this quilt. As Gwen mentioned, there's a lot of old Brunswick County names here. See how many of the names you recognize, and maybe you'll find somebody in your family. Miss Betty Milligan, who was born in 1886. Miss Letha Sellers, born in 1939, who was my grandmother on my father's side. Miss Mildred Bennett, born in 1918. An S.C. King, who was born in 1884. Roni Mintz, or Ronnie Mintz, I'm not quite sure how she pronounced it, born in 1884.
It's Roni.
Roni. Alison Bennett, born in 1926, who is my wife's aunt. Miss Lilia Evans, born in 1914. Miss Myrtle H., born in 1901. Miss Cora Phelps, born in 1883. Miss Milky Milligan, born in 1861. Miss Glenn Lennon, born in 1926. Miss Alta Fernside, born in July 11, 1904. Miss Lizzie M., born in 1923. Miss Curry Bennett, 1900. L.A. Ross, 1856. Daphne Bennett, born in 1921, who is also my wife's other aunt that's on this quilt. Elizabeth Ray, 1884. An A.M.K., that's just her initials, born in 1898. Lucy Lennon, born in 1889. Miss Lucy Lennon, that was the mother of, some of you may remember, a Clarence Lennon and a Frank Lennon that lived on Highway 211. Mr. Clarence ran an egg farm for years. But anyway, that was their mother. Miss Georgia May Clemens, who was my great aunt, born in 1918. Miss Thelma Bennett, who is my wife's grandmother, born in 1902. Miss Louise W., don't know the last name, born in 1923. And then a Lucy W., again, don't know the last name, born in 1894. And a Rebecca Babson, born in 1881. Did you recognize any names? Maybe a few, some of the old timers, maybe. Whenever Mickey showed the quilt to Betsy and I, to me, it was just a quilt, to begin with. But then when I saw that it had Betsy's wife's parent, had her ancestors on it, that made it a little bit more intriguing to me. And then when I saw that it had my family's name on it, it made it that much more intriguing to me. I kind of felt like the lady who recently, and some of you may have heard about the lady who went to a thrift store and bought a bust for $39.99, and turned out that it was it was 2,000 years old of a Roman general's bust, and it went from worth not $39.99 to I don't know what it's worth now, but in our hearts, this is more valuable than we can't put numbers on it because it links us to our past. We actually know that my grandmother, and this is hand sewn. This is by hand. That my grandmother used her hands to put this together. That her grandmother used her hands to put this together, and that's what makes it special to us. I've got some other examples here just to show you. This was a quilt here, or this was a quilt top that was put together. It was being put together to make a quilt, another friendship quilt, but it never made it for whatever reason. People die, people move. We don't know the reason, but it has some other ladies' names on it, and it was put together to be made into a friendship quilt. Yes, most of these are from Exum. All this was found in this Estelle Meeks, a trunk that Miss Estelle Meeks from Exeter had, and she passed away. And my wife's mother, Betty Warren, she got the trunk, was given the trunk, and so we found these. And I did want to show you just on one of the squares she had, and this was from a magazine. I don't know, it's got Sears in it, it's got Silvertone, but it's just a magazine, cutouts of a magazine that they used as the pattern for their squares. So they used whatever they had. The quilting bees that these ladies went to years ago, they were popular for probably the main reason was it was a good way to find out what was going on in the community, because they didn't have such things as TikTok and Facebook and all those things that we have now. This was when they had a spelling bee. That was probably their form of TikTok. You know,
About quilting bee, not a spelling bee.
by quilting bee. Yeah, exactly right. But anyway, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer. Like I say, I don't know a lot about quilting, but I do appreciate history. I do appreciate, especially handmade history. And this was certainly a part of the history of Brunswick County. I think